This lecture will focus on the circumstances surrounding each of the two sides of the Civil War, the Union, or the North, and the Confederacy, or the South. So when it came to the actual fighting forces of the military, each side did have advantages, but the biggest advantage definitely laid in the South with the Army. The South had the best military strength. Many officers had to decide when America split, when the Confederacy split off, whether they were going to go with the Confederacy or stay in their post as an American officer. About 330, or no, exactly 313 officers, which is about 1/3 of the total amount of officers, resigned their post as an American general or officer to join with the Confederacy and fight with and lead men in the South. The other thing that was happening is at this time, America had 8 military colleges, 8 military academies where they would train officers and how to best lead their men and do those kinds of things. And 7 of those 8 academies, those 8 colleges, were in the South. And so the South had a lot of trained officers to lead their army. Not only that, but the South were just better fighters. The people in the North were working in factories and doing things like that, right? And the people in South were farming, and so they were on horses a lot. They knew how to do that. They knew how to move around. They used guns on a daily basis in their job, whether it was running off a wild animal or hunting or whatever, that kind of stuff. So they were living in a more rural area and doing different things, which gave them the advantage of being honestly the better fighters of the two between the South and the North. The North's big advantage was on the sea. Okay, they had a strong navy. They had most of the officers, I believe. It was about 3/4 of all the United States Navy's officers were from the North. But more important than the officers, more important than the people in charge, was the actual ships themselves. Most of the warships were in the North because most of the shipyards that built these warships were in the North. It was or all of the shipyards were in the North except for 2. So all of them were under control of the North except for 2 for this war. And so that gave them the advantage of having more ships and being able to build more ships as the war drug on. So the economic advantages were almost all in the North. The North had a far stronger economy than the South, and had an economy in most of the important parts of the South, or sorry, in most of the important parts when it came to war. The North had a larger population by like 2.5. If you look at this, estimates are a little bit different, but you can see right up here, we've got the population is at least double in 1860 for the North. And then farm acreage, that's the one thing the South is a little better at. They've got that farm acreage, but the big problem with that farm acreage is it was making cash crops. So it was making things like cotton and tobacco, and you can't feed an army with cotton and tobacco. You have to be able to trade that to get the food that you need. Okay, so that shows kind of the bottom part, the value of the farmland. Okay, North has more value to that farmland, even though they have less farmland overall. You can see that over twice as much railway mileage. They had over twice as much railroads, which allowed you to move products really quickly and efficiently, and move your troops and people really quickly and efficiently. Okay. Next up is manufacturing establishments. So that's like factories. You need factories to build weapons, to build guns, to build the technology that these men needed to fight this war. And you can see that the North had incredibly more manufacturing establishments than the South. As a matter of fact, if we look back over here, the North had about 90% of all the manufacturing. Okay, and that includes like the control of the iron, the actual raw material that was needed to make these weapons. Okay, and then we see those workers inside of manufacturing, and again, big advantage over here. Okay, for the North. the value of manufacturing. Of course, all of the manufacturing stuff is going to be there. And then last but not least, okay, is this capital stock in banks. So the banks, how much money do they have that they can use to loan out or to borrow to businesses or to pay for these different things. All right, and we'll talk more about the money in the next slide. But the railroads, the manufacturing, the population, this all was a huge advantage for the North. So financially, how did these two sides pay for the war, and what position were they in before it? The North was in a pretty good position because they were the actual country of the United States. All the establishments belonged to them, and so they controlled the entire national treasury. They were going to keep getting money from all of the tariffs that were already established and already set up. So all the people that were moving products in or out were still paying those taxes, and that went to the Union government because that was the United States government. But some people started to get nervous about, is the North actually going to be able to win this war? Are we able to get it? And so they started to take their gold and their silver out of banks. They wanted to hold on to that material that they saw as valuable rather than having it inside the bank where it was theoretically safe, but they weren't sure it was actually going to be safe forever if they lost or if the government lost and kind of failed. And so they took that, and that's not something that they were able to use, or the banks were not able to buy government bonds then with this gold and silver. There was no gold and silver there, and since they couldn't buy government bonds, which remember, if you don't know, I think we talked about this before, but a bond is like a loan. So the government would be saying, I need some money, I need some gold and silver, and we'll give it back to you with interest. We'll give more back to you than what you got. And so if you can't use that gold and silver, the banks can't use that gold and silver to buy the government bonds, then the government doesn't have any gold and silver. And without gold and silver, without that actual valuable thing, the government can't pay suppliers, they can't pay troops, they can't pay for the people that are fighting for them, or pay for the supplies that they need for those people. And so Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. And the Legal Tender Act created this up here, okay, a national currency. This national currency allowed the government to create some paper money as opposed to using just gold and silver to pay off these people. They could pay with this paper money that was representative of the value of gold or silver. All right, and uh, this paper money was called greenbacks because of its color. As you can see, it's primarily green, and so that's what they called them, greenbacks, because the back of it was mostly green. The Confederacy was in a worse situation. Most Southern planters were in debt. They didn't have money that they could buy bonds with, and so the only way that the government was going to make any money was to tax people. And so they first off tried to tax trade, but the North was super quick to, we'll talk about later, blockade the ports. So they blocked them off and they weren't able to trade with anybody. The South was basically not able to trade very much. So that less trade meant they were making less money to be able to pay their troops and buy their supplies. And so the Confederacy ended up having to put in new taxes on their people, on the Southerners. But many of the Southerners refused to pay, and it just wasn't going very well. Because they didn't have enough money, by the end of the war, the Confederacy had to print out their own paper money, Confederate money, and this caused big issues because they didn't have value to back it up really. And so it caused inflation. By the end of the war, there was 9,000% inflation. Okay, so 9,000%. That's a huge amount of inflation, where your dollar is worth so much less than before. Something that cost $1 at the beginning of the war would cost $9,000 at the end of the war. That's an incredibly high rate of inflation. Now, North had their own inflation issues too. They had about 80%, but obviously at 80% is much more manageable than a 9,000% inflation rate. Take a moment to write out the answer to this checkpoint question. So there were definitely some political problems in the North. Some of Lincoln's biggest problems were with every group, with the Republicans and the Democrats, because he just wanted to keep the country together. And with the Republicans, a lot of them were abolitionists and they wanted slavery to end. But again, he's saying, I just want to keep the country together any way we can, even if we have to continue to have slavery in the South. I don't want it to expand, but I want to keep the country together and stop this war, stop us from killing each other. And then he also had problems with the Democrats because none of the Democrats wanted anything to do with ending slavery. But there were two groups of Democrats: the war Democrats, who were for the war. They liked the idea of the war to bring the Union together, but were completely against ending slavery. And then the peace Democrats, who were against the war completely and wanted to bring the country back together, not end slavery, but wanted to bring the country back together through negotiating and actually talking to each other. And, this is a big problem because Lincoln couldn't be seen as an abolitionist. If he was trying to end slavery, he would lose those border states that were slave states that he had on his side that were very, very important in the scheme of things. He really needed those states on his side to be able to win. And so another big disagreement between Republicans and Democrats was about conscription. And conscription is forcing people into military service. So we call it the draft now, conscription. So what happened is we were deciding, do we need to have conscription? Do we need to not have conscription? And so in 1862, Congress decided that in order to get the numbers that we needed for the military, they would pass the militia law. And this would force the conscription, or they would force conscription or the draft on states that couldn't get enough volunteers to sign up for the army. This was majorly opposed by Democrats, and so in heavily Democratic areas, there were riots and things like that. So Abraham Lincoln decided to take away civil rights. He took away one of those important things from that Bill of Rights. He took away the writs of habeas corpus, and habeas corpus says that a person has the right to not be imprisoned unless they're charged with a crime and given a trial. Okay, so that speedy trial thing, right? So you have to be charged with something and you have to be given a trial. And Lincoln said, for right now, we're not going to do that. Okay, we're going to allow our troops and police and stuff to put people in prison indefinitely, meaning forever, until we don't know when we'll stop it, but we're going to put them in prison indefinitely and without trial. And he suspended that writ for anybody who supported the rebels, so supported the South, or encouraged other people to resist the draft. Okay, and so he basically said, you're going to do this, you're going to be on our side, and if you are out doing that or going against what we need to happen, then we will put you in prison and not charge you with any. I mean, we don't have to charge you with anything. We can put you in prison as long as we want. Okay. The Southern political issues were there as well. The Southern government was also having problems. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was having some major issues with how the government was set up. He was running into a lot of the same problems that the Articles of Confederation had. His constitution, this constitution that was created by the Confederates that we read about before, was all about states' rights. So each state had the right to kind of run themselves, and he had very little power, and the Confederate government had very little power, and so this hurt his ability to make quick decisions, wartime-like decisions. So things like conscription, where they're forcing people to fight, or martial law, where the government kind of takes over and makes you have very particular rules that are supported by the military. Like some states were against that and wouldn't let him do that within their borders. And so that was a big problem. And if we look at this map, you can kind of see these are all very different states with very different opinions, right? We've got against secession is red, okay, and for secession is orange, and then the purple's kind of divided. And you can see places like North Carolina, they're all about it, right? They're all about the Confederacy. They're going to follow through with that. But then places like Tennessee is about half and half. Georgia, we see a lot. Alabama, we see a lot. So depending on the area, it was really hard to move through and get them to agree on anything. It was to the point where if Virginia was so divided up here that it actually ended up in the middle of the war splitting off into two different states. And West Virginia, a new state, was created and added to the Union in 1863. So it just kind of shows you that it's hard to agree when everybody has that equal power and we don't have one government kind of running the show here. The Europeans were also stuck in the middle. Especially the British and the French. The North wanted them to stay out of it, respect the blockade on the South, like don't try and fight us over it, just don't send your ships through, we're going to stop them, okay, but just stay out of it. This is our fight, we'll deal with it. And the South wanted them to recognize the South, the Confederacy, as a country and provide them help, get help from France and Britain. And they knew that the textile factories, these factories that were making cloth over in Britain and in France, really needed the cotton from America. And so what they did is to pressure them, they stopped selling them the cotton, they stopped selling them the raw materials that they need until they met these demands of recognizing them as a country. And so the South, when they met up with the European nations, kind of tried to pressure Europe into recognizing them. And France said, I don't know, I guess we'll recognize you if the British do. So if they do it, we'll do it, but you deal with them and figure it out. And the British said, I'm not going to yet. We're not going to do that. We're going to stay out of it and just try and not be a part of it. And because they didn't want to risk war with the United States, they said maybe if the Confederacy can prove they can actually win the war and isn't just this thing, if they can go into the North and win some battles, then maybe we'll join them. But at this point, they didn't think it was worth the risk. The Civil War is seen as the first modern war because technology completely changed this war. And the technology that changed this war was the rifle. Okay, and the rifle shot bullets like this instead of a round ball, a musket. You're seeing that everybody had these rifles that had these conical, or like I almost think of them as like half a football shaped bullets, okay, more close to what we have now. And so what happened is you could have these larger armies made up of civilian soldiers. All you really had to do was teach them how to move and teach them how to shoot. They didn't really need to have that hand-to-hand combat near as much as back in the days of muskets and before guns, right? This was more about ranged combat, staying further away and shooting at people, okay? And so the rifle with the cone-shaped bullet, what it did is it made it so much easier to shoot and so much more accurate. And so if you were doing a charge, if you were charging someone, then you would get shot more times. Your line would get shot more times than in the previous iteration, because before musket balls you had to wait until they were really really close to be able to shoot and be accurate at all, but you could shoot from a long ways away and be accurate with a rifle. And so you might get shot at 5, 6, 7, 8 times where you used to maybe be able to cross that field and no one would shoot at you the whole time. And so that would happen. And so this war became a different kind of war than anything before. It became a war of attrition. And attrition, kind of a fancy word here, attrition just means wearing down one side by exhausting their soldiers and resources. So we're going to take away, we're eventually going to make you run out of soldiers or run out of resources, and then we can win the war. But until then, we're just both going to take hits, and there's no way of really winning with strategy. It's just all about lasting longer than the other guy. And so high casualties for these fights were a big deal. Okay, people were in trenches, dug into the ground and not able to be hit, just shooting as people came after them, behind barricades. and the charges would have a lot of death. Okay, a lot of people would die during these charges, and so the soldiers needed to be constantly replaced to keep on fighting and to keep your military strong. We needed new soldiers to come in and replace the dead or injured ones. And of course, this is going to benefit the North because the North had 2.5 times as many people as the South, and so they had 2.5 times as many qualified soldiers. So this modern war definitely was beneficial to the North. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. So the South strategy, and really the best strategy for them, the strategy that would actually win it for them, for the South, was to perform a defensive war and a war of attrition where you're very careful about where you're battling to where you're sure that you can win, and you need to avoid heavy losses where you're losing a whole lot of people. Even if you win the battle, it's probably better to retreat if you're going to lose a lot of your soldiers. Okay, so you're going to attack when you think you have a good opportunity to really do a big hit on the other team, but you're going to retreat when you think, we might win this battle because we're better fighters, but we might lose like half of our guys, which would be way too much. And the Union will eventually spend their resources, spend their soldiers, and get sick of fighting. And then at that point, the Union will negotiate, recognize the Confederacy, and allow it to happen, which is what the Confederacy wanted. They wanted to be their own country. The Southerners, however, the people actually fighting, they didn't like this. Okay, they saw themselves as better fighters, and they were better fighters, but there was not nearly as much of them. And so often they didn't follow orders, and they charged in and tried to fight as hard as they could to the last man, and refused to retreat. They were definitely the braver fighters of the two, but because of that, they suffered very high casualties and they lost a lot of troops. And eventually, as we'll see, they're kind of just going to run out of troops. In most of the battles, they inflicted a whole lot of damage on the North, but if they lost, it was because they just ran out of people to continue to send after the North. The North strategy was a little bit different. They had a plan called the Anaconda Plan. This was Winfield Scott's plan. And Winfield Scott, remember him from the Mexican-American War. He was a general that was very successful there. He had this plan, and he said, here's what we're going to do. Here's all the different points of it. First off, first point, we're going to blockade the southern ports of the Atlantic. So we're looking at this Atlantic Ocean. You're going to blockade everything over here. You're going to stop all of these ports, set up your ships, and not allow any trade to get in or out of these ports. The second thing that would do is that would isolate the Confederacy. It would not allow any European countries to come in and give them supplies or give them military help or give them anything. So if you shut that down, then you shut off any help that Europe can give them, and it cuts off the supplies because the only other place to get supplies is from the North, and the North isn't going to give them any supplies, right? The second part of this plan, I know it's down there in the middle uh, as far as bullet points here, but the first three kind of all go together. The second part was they wanted to control the Mississippi River right here, and they wanted to control that with gunboats. So they had these smaller boats, and they would try to control that and shut down all the ports there and shut down any traffic that wasn't theirs. And what this would do is it would divide the eastern part of the Confederacy, which is this part within the snake, and it would divide them from this part out here, parts of Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, all that kind of stuff. And so that was a big part of it too, was to cut the South into two pieces. And then they wanted to capture New Orleans, Vicksburg, Memphis, some of these big port cities that were important to moving stuff. Okay, and basically what that would do is it would completely cut off shipping from the interior. It would cut off shipping from other places if they could control these major ports that were on the Mississippi River. All right, and so a lot of people wanted the war to just be over, and so they wanted a huge invasion of the South, get in there, take Richmond, end the war quickly, and be over with it. Lincoln started with Scott's plan. He decided this is a good plan and started to put together everything and work towards it. That was the strategy he chose, but he did think a quick victory in Virginia might bring in an end to the war quickly, and so he did send in General McClellan to try and accomplish that. All right, quickly write out 3 questions you have from these notes so far. If you have no questions, create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test.